Hi everyone. On behalf of the Toby Center for Jewish Studies, I want to welcome you to this year's Clara Sumpf lecture in Yiddish. You might have heard us frantically trying to figure out when this series started. We believe it was sometime in the late 1990s. I bring this up because the Sumpf lecture series has a particular quirk. The lecturer is required to give 2 lectures, one of which has to be in Yiddish. So earlier today, Ross gave a fascinating Yiddish language talk on Judeo-languages in New York and the history of Jewish sociolinguistics and why caring about the languages of other folks is a deeply embedded value within Jewish thought vis-a-vis languages. That talk was entitled Sprachen beim Hudson, which is a reference to Isaac Bashevis Singer's Soten beim Hudson. I'm trying to prove I paid attention, even though quite a bit took place on the East River, and it was not named for Sholem Asch's novel East River. And there was quite a lot of discussion of New Yorkish as a thing that people spoke, but there were no references to the Lamed Shapiro story, New Yorkish. Anyway, I mention all of this in part because we believe that this is the first time that a Stanford undergraduate alum has ever given the Sumpf lecture, perhaps because of this quirk. So we're very delighted to present that. Ross Perlin is co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, a nonprofit research institute focusing on documenting and supporting endangered languages in New York City and beyond. At ELA since 2013, he directed the creation of the languages of the city of New York, and has managed a variety of projects focused on language documentation, language policy, and public programming around urban linguistic diversity. Himalayan languages are a research focus for his PhD in linguistics at the University of Bern. Ross created a trilingual dictionary, a corpus of recordings, and a descriptive grammar of Trung, an endangered language of Southwest China based on several years of field work. Ross, as I mentioned, has a BA from Stanford, an MPhil from Cambridge, and an MA from the University of London SOAS. Ross is also a writer and translator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, The Atlantic, and In Geweb, a journal of Yiddish research. Ross previously also hosted the popular web series, A New Yorker Yid in China, a New York Jew in Russia, documenting his, in China, documenting his experiences in China in 2010-2011. This was followed up with a second video series for the Yiddish Daily Forward, culminating in one of my favorite Yiddish language YouTube shorts, A Shtetl Bam Yam, or A Shtetl by the Sea, an ode to Jewish Miami Beach, where Ross describes his family history and many visits to Miami Beach. His most recent book is called Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, published in 2024 by Grove. Please join me in welcoming Ross Perlin.
Thank you, Eitan, for the most enjoyable introduction, I think, that I've had. And thank you all for coming. Thanks to Shana and to Eva and to Eitan and for everybody involved with the Clara Sumpf lectures. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. A special thanks also to those who are bearing with me in a second language as well, who were there earlier for the Yiddish talk. That was really, as Eitan said, focused on endangered Jewish linguistic diversity, especially our work on it in New York. And then I thought this would be a much broader kind of book talk in a way. So you'll see Language City, which is there, and Eitan mentioned is kind of the fuller story. But this is going to be in general about languages in cities, urban linguistic diversity, endangered languages in an era when, perhaps paradoxically, last speakers in many cases are actually coming to cities, moving to cities. What does that mean, that cities are unprecedentedly linguistically diverse at a time when languages are disappearing? Present day New York City is, as far as I know, from our research, the most linguistically diverse city, not just in the world, but in the history of the world. Eitan mentioned the Languages of New York City project map. I'll show a little bit of that, but that's where we've kind of substantiated the presence of 750 plus and counting languages, which is more than 10% of the world's total spoken in the New York area. It's not that other cities are not linguistically diverse. They almost certainly would show similar levels of diversity, perhaps, in cases like London or Paris, Johannesburg, Jakarta, San Francisco, Los Angeles, but nobody has mapped languages in cities beyond the basic census data. So we'll talk about that. People have not really looked at cities as sites of linguistic diversity in this way before. So yeah, the fuller story is here, is there. Happy to talk more about the book. It's basically three things in one. On the one hand, it's a linguistic history of New York City. And I don't think there have really been linguistic histories of cities before, especially ones that focus beyond the major couple of languages that you would assume. So it's also a call for more linguistic histories of cities. I saw one may have just come out in Paris, in French, a history of Paris through the lens of language. But I think it's a way of seeing cities that hopefully more people will start to explore. So it's a linguistic history of the city, starting with Lenape, the original language of the land. I'll talk a little about that. And then through now 400, almost exactly 401 years of colonial history. And I'll do a very kind of quick potted history of how did New York sort of get to where it is, also as a demonstration of how we could think about the linguistic histories of other cities. At the same time, the book is also the story of this organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, which, as Eitan mentioned, I've been co-director of. It's been around since 2010. I'll talk a little bit about that. The only organization so far that's working on urban linguistic diversity, thinking about these issues. And then it's also a series of portraits of 6 speakers of endangered languages from different parts of the world, including Yiddish, which is perhaps the least endangered of them all, which is interesting, or it's becoming unendangered, really right in the middle of Brooklyn, of all places, because of Hasidic Yiddish speakers. But the languages featured are from all over, so I'll talk a little bit about those as well. But let's start kind of at the broadest possible level, I guess, just to be on the same page. Many of you might already be familiar with this, but there are many more languages in the world than I think most people think. And I think even when I was an undergraduate here at Stanford, if I'd been asked to specify how many languages are in the world, I might have said, well, there are, approximately 200 nation states. I know there are some languages which are not, the official national languages. Maybe there are 1,000. I didn't really know until, my early 20s that there are over 7,000 languages from around the world, from hundreds of different language families, including something like 130 or so language isolates, languages which have no known established relationship to any language family. And you might ask, well, what does that mean? Where do they come from? How is that? Well, there are a number of reasons why you might have language isolates. We may just not know what family to put them in. So there are these famous debated cases. Probably the most famous one is Basque. Where does Basque fit in? Linguists have tried to argue that it's Indo-European, or that it's even Dravidian from South India, or that it's somehow connected to languages in the Caucasus. All kinds of arguments. Even certain famous ancient languages, which we don't have speakers of anymore, like Etruscan and Sumerian, were perhaps language isolates. It could be that in some of those cases, other languages in the family disappeared without leaving a trace. It could be that the signal has weakened over time and that we just don't have enough evidence to connect it to other languages. But in any case, without wanting to lay too much stress on numbers, because data about languages is kind of notoriously difficult to wrangle for any number of reasons, we can say that most linguists now hold by this kind of 7,000-ish number. And the most widely used database, Ethnologue, which is created by an organization called the Summer Institute of Linguistics, an evangelical Christian organization based in Dallas, but does kind of an amazing range of work around especially Bible translation, but also creating dictionaries and all sorts of other things. And they kind of actually, in some ways, control what gets considered to be a language through ISO codes. That's the International Standards Organization, which also kind of stamps like everything from wooden planks to tables and all kinds of standardization things. And there are also a similar code for languages. Anyway, that aside, part of the basic issue is just what's a language, what's a dialect. There's a very famous Yiddish phrase, which maybe this is the one kind of bit of Yiddish we can add in here, which is that a Sprach is a dialect mit an Armee und a Flot. A language is a dialect with an army and a navy. This kind of came via Max Weinreich, famous Yiddishist and linguist, but seems to have been something that was said by an anonymous Bronx school teacher at a talk that Weinreich was giving. Some have said maybe it was Joshua Fishman, who then was a Yiddishist who went on to be a founding figure of sociolinguistics. But in any case, the point is that there are political notions of language, and then there are kind of linguists' notions. the two don't necessarily kind of coincide. Linguists try to talk in terms of mutual intelligibility. To what extent can people understand each other if they're speaking in a normal, natural way? But by that criterion, Cantonese, Fujianese, Shanghainese, and Mandarin should all be considered different languages, whereas traditionally they're considered different dialects of Chinese, or Fangyan in Chinese. And then kind of taking the opposite sort of case, the languages of Scandinavia, like Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, generally speakers report a pretty high degree of mutual intelligibility, but once those became independent, separate polities, we have to talk about sort of national languages, Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish. So linguistic diversity we should talk about not just in numerical terms, like 7,000 plus languages and innumerable dialects, but also in terms of genealogical and structural diversity. By genealogical, I just mean language families, which reflect developments in many cases thousands of years old, although not nearly as old as human language itself. So with a language family like Indo-European, we're talking about a time depth of maybe 6,000 to 7,000 years, but human language has been around for well over 100,000 years from what we know. We don't know much beyond about 7,000 years ago, because that's when the very few kind of written sources we have, like Sumerian cuneiform, sort of go away, and then the methods of historical linguistics only kind of get us back to maybe 6,000, 7,000 years ago. They're trying to sort of push beyond that, but more kind of crucially for us, I guess, the vast majority of the world's languages are sort of not what we think of, perhaps, when we think of language. They are primarily oral. They have no support from any kinds of governments. They're not on the internet. Only something like 5% of the world's languages are meaningfully on the internet. The kind of monolingualism that is now quite common in at least parts of the US is pretty historically rare. Multilingualism was the historical norm. Most languages are not well documented. Something like 2,000 plus languages have only a word list. That's just a list of words with some basic glosses into a language of wider communication. So no dictionary, no grammar, no books in even the best libraries here with the best librarians. The books don't exist. These are oral languages, and even sort of recordings or other forms of documentation are barely available. And linguists are just starting to kind of and language activists to kind of improve on this. And there are new digital language archives that are being created, but this is sort of the work of which I've been a part for the last couple of decades. So linguistic diversity is not evenly distributed. There are certain parts of the world that are particular hotspots, often with strong parallels to biodiversity hotspots, places like the Himalaya, places like Papua New Guinea, places like West Africa. And there's a real entanglement between linguistic, cultural, and biodiversity. So I'll just kind of very quickly sort of do a few other things to sort of set the table, but this is a map, I love maps, showing kind of where some of those linguistic hotspots are, just to sort of demonstrate how kind of challenging it is to even wrap our heads around global linguistic diversity. This kind of nice quote from David Crystal referring to the ethnologue, actually an earlier version of the ethnologue where they were still sort of counting and debating the status of many languages, and that still continues to go on with each new edition. So this one only had 6,700 languages, and there are languages for various reasons that are still being quote unquote discovered. And that's not necessarily, although it can in some cases be about sort of uncontacted tribes in places like West Papua or the Amazon. Yes, that is one factor, but it's more likely to be so-called hidden diversity, that actually within a seemingly familiar language like Tibetan, once people do more detailed field work in certain areas of the Tibetan plateau, they're able to establish that actually the way that people in this set of villages speak or that set of villages speak really constitutes a different language from at least linguistic evidence. And then language naming is also just a huge kind of challenge to really sort of understand. People have all kinds of ways of referring to their language. And I think even Ladino, there's one count that there are something like 70 different recorded names for Ladino that speakers had used. So not just Ladino, but Judesmo and also Español de Nosotros, our Spanish, and all kinds of variations on it. These things were not being standardized. And this is true, the example here is that of how, Fujianese speakers in New York, huge community, all the different kinds of ways that they might write and name their language. And a paradigmatic place for linguistic diversity, just to think about, is a place like Papua New Guinea, which has, it's the world's second largest island. We're talking about, on average, 10,000 speakers per language, but many that have far fewer. And I just, went to my favorite place on this campus, actually, the Papua New Guinea Sculpture Garden, and was just looking to see kind of, how that place has been over the last 20 years since I hadn't walked back there, and just to see that, you have right here work from the Kwama and Yatmul peoples. Kwama is a language with fewer than 2,000 speakers, not really well described. Yatmul a little bit larger, but pretty extraordinary that that's kind of right here. And this is a new sort of linguistic hotspot, and this is what I'll be focusing on more today. This is from our language map of New York. Here you have, 750 going on 800 languages kind of in a single city, and that's for a whole different set of reasons, right, that have to do with migration and urbanization. In Papua New Guinea, it's a whole kind of complex set of reasons that have partly to do with natural terrain. Of course, islands and mountains make a big difference. The lack of centralized states makes a big difference. But also certain kinds of language attitudes and ways of identifying around language. I mentioned genealogical diversity, language families. I won't go into it too much more, I think. So we can think about diversity in different ways, and of course, there still are battles over those language families. And in the case of Papua New Guinea, for instance, there's this proposal for what's called Trans-New Guinea, which would actually sort of take these 127 families that linguists have been kind of talking about and trying to sort languages into, and really reduce it to a handful. But it would be at a very high level of generality, where we actually, just because two languages are part of the same family, that can mean very different things. If you're talking about the Turkic languages, let's say Uyghur and Uzbek and Turkish, the time depth is much less, and there's actually a degree of mutual intelligibility that people will report across those, whereas other language families might have a much greater time depth, and people might understand each other much less, and it might only be sort of historical linguists who can really prove and see those kind of historical connections. Some maps of linguistic diversity to get us kind of thinking about mapping. Very different kinds of patterning according to geography and topography. Very different kinds of structures if we think about the diversity of language structures. I won't get too sort of technical, but there are intriguing distributions of features like tone, for instance, which kind of most famously through Sinitic languages. People will be familiar with all the languages of Sinitic, meaning sort of all the forms of things we call Chinese, Mandarin having 4 tones, tone having to do with sort of pitch being used in regular ways to make meaning in a language, right? But it's not necessarily just something that patterns in certain language families, but also has an interesting areal distribution, that there are parts of the world where tone seems to be, even across different language families. This is from a cool website called the World Atlas of Linguistic Structures. It's now in a sort of new version, but it basically looks by feature, linguistic feature, at kind of how diversity patterns. And features actually are in these kind of complex relationships with each other. So tone has a connection with syllable structure. So you actually have to kind of look at them the two of them together. So that's more of the technical kind of stuff, just giving a taste of it. But language endangerment is now a universal phenomenon. And we can say that languages have always come and gone, but what's happening today is unprecedented. It's clearly connected to the loss of botanical and biological diversity. It's happening in some of the same places. It's happening for many of the same reasons. It's connected with colonialism. It's connected with nation states. It's connected with capitalism. It's connected with forces which are spreading everywhere. And it's not just people switching to English. It's people switching to Tok Pisin in Papua New Guinea. It's people switching to Nepali. It's a whole kind of sea change in our way of being on the planet, I think, and a major planetary event. Sheer numbers of speakers are perhaps less important than intergenerational transmission, and that's what's being, that's what's kind of being snapped today. whether parents are passing on the language to children. Under normal circumstances, people will want to pass on a mother tongue. It will happen pretty naturally, but the pressures today to switch are enormous. So this is a kind of pretty detailed breakdown. This is used by the ethnologue and others, actually based on the work of Joshua Fishman on language endangerment, of just kind of how linguists are trying, with very limited information, to categorize and think about different levels of endangerment, all the way from, you know, international and national languages that are very safe and are used in all spheres and being passed on fully, all the way to languages that are, and there are different terms that are used. People these days will try to avoid terms like extinct or dormant and prefer sometimes words like sleeping or reawakening. But however you sort of put it, there is this kind of decline of endangerment, and there are many languages, including many languages of California, which are essentially down to a single speaker. And then there are languages like the language of the place we're in. I don't know what the latest is in terms of revitalization efforts around Ohlone, but it's, you know, across California there are, and across the world now, a growing number of language revitalization movements, which is a story unto itself. And so paradoxically, perhaps, we're also in a moment of, or perhaps a golden age of language revitalization. It's hugely challenging work, but in some cases, even languages that have ceased to be spoken can be brought back and picked up again in certain ways. Not long ago, I was in Hawaii, where the major conference on language endangerment and documentation happens, and it's led by Hawaiian revivalists who've brought Hawaiian back from the brink to having now something like 20,000 new speakers, mostly in the last few decades. We're showing maps and talking about a world of 7,000 plus languages, but this is the reality that those languages are trying to fit in, the world of 200-ish nation states. And very few nations really have policies that encourage multilingual ecologies such as existed historically. Yeah. And then, you know, even beyond that, there's an even smaller number of the so-called global languages that are exerting just tremendous pressure. So there's new thinking about what's been called language justice, showing that there's kind of nothing natural about what's going on, although people want to kind of naturalize and say, oh, well, you know, you're no longer, you know, the language is not useful, so you cease to speak it. But there's much more going on in the pressures that people are facing. And there are a lot of important questions, I think, here. What does it mean when so many languages have one speaker or a few speakers? They're not being used in daily life. And in terms of what you can document, it's a big challenge or a big question, because, you know, even just think about the languages that you know or you speak. How many speakers would you want? What would be an adequate level of documentation to really understand what is in that language? All of the speech genres, the songs, the proverbs, the jokes, the ideas, the words. You know, what if you were seen as like the font of knowledge for a particular language? Would that be an adequate representation of it? The language of New York City, Lenape Hoking, the place itself is down to a single speaker. I visit her. She's in Canada in her 80s in the book, although mostly I profile Karen Moscow, who is a second language speaker, part of a language revitalization movement around Lenape, who, as far as we know, is the first person to bring the language back to New York. This is a Lenape class in our office on 18th Street in Manhattan. She would drive, totally kind of unpaid on her own dime, 10 hours every month down from Canada, one of the Lenape reserves. There are Lenape communities today, hundreds of miles from New York City, people having been driven out, in Canada, in Oklahoma, and in Wisconsin, and teach whoever wanted to learn. And passed away before the book came out, but is one of, kind of spread the language to hundreds of people, at least some words, some degree of knowledge of it, and would always kind of greet us with Kwenganawalomwa, which is just showing a bit of the complexity of this Algonquian language, where you have prefix k, which is a first to second person prefix. You see this in these languages, and just in only certain few other language families in the world, where the prefix actually marks first person on second person action. So it's not just, the subject, but the subject and the object is a prefix to mark that relationship. There's another one for second person on third person on first person, and then the verbal plural ending. So, we have to kind of just keep hearing the words and looking at the words. This is a little bit of the series of displacements that led to Lenape being where it is today. The Dutch established New Amsterdam, actually the Dutch West India Company, and create on the Lenape archipelago a unique colony, an entrepot, a port city controlled by a company different from the other 12 colonies that were being established, mostly as kind of English language places by English settlers. And for the first 40 plus years of its existence, this is an entrepot, a mix of peoples from all over who are coming to this Dutch West India Company place. So the very first Catholic priest to come reported that the Dutch West India Company Director General thought that there were speakers of 18 different languages on what was then really Lower Manhattan among the first just 400 to 500 people who were there. Now, there was no list, unfortunately, provided of what those languages were or what they thought a language was, what counted as a language. I've tried to reconstruct it as part of understanding the linguistic history of the city. And whether or not this is what was meant, I think what we have to see is that this was already a place where a template was being set at the fulcrum of 3 different continents. You have the Native American languages, which were extremely important at that time, and you had some of the original Dutch settlers also speaking it, and you had interpretation being part of the life of the colony. So that's Lenape, but also visiting native languages like Mohawk and Mohican. You had the languages of enslaved Africans who were brought very soon, very early in the history of the colony as well, clearly from particular places, speaking particular languages in West Africa, such as Akan from what's today Ghana, Kimbundu and Kikongo from what's today kind of Angola and the Congo. And of course, the conditions for actually speaking and using and maintaining these languages, we have only kind of limited evidence, which I try to explore in the book. What was that actually like to bring these languages to New Amsterdam? Hard to say. It was challenging, to say the least. And then you have these languages of Europe, which were, to a large degree, actually minority languages as well, many of which are today considered endangered. So Peter Stuyvesant, the most famous kind of early figure there, is actually from a Frisian family. The very first settlers, the so-called Walloon settlers, were religious refugees who came almost exactly 400 years ago from what's today the French-Belgian border, speaking Walloon, which is a distinct language related to French, but quite different. So this was in a time, before the current kind of nation-state map, but it's clear that a certain template of linguistic diversity was being set, that even when the English take over after those initial decades and rename the place New York and try to push English in various ways, they're constantly sort of frustrated with this polyglot colony of theirs. But immigration is fundamentally kind of the driving force of the city's history, I argue. And it's immigration of minority language peoples, those who have the most kind of incentive to come. I think this is maybe true of immigration more broadly. It's certainly true in the history of New York. This is just a sort of an initial kind of mapping, I know hard to read, showing that when people talk about a Spanish migration, it was actually Galician. When people talk about a French migration, it was actually heavily Breton. When people talk about an Italian migration, very few spoke standard Italian. They spoke various so-called dialetti from southern Italy. They were coming at a time when Italy itself had just been unified, if we talk about the main migration of the late 19th century, and the rate of speaking of these national languages was tiny. Likewise, for the world of Kleindeutschland, which has been called the first institutionally complete urban neighborhood in the US to function in a language other than English, but it wasn't functioning in sort of German, plain German. It actually had even newspapers in Schwabian and Plattdeutsch and all these Germanic varieties at a time when Germany itself was not yet a unified country, and there was extraordinary linguistic diversity. Of course, we could talk about Ellis Island, where it's important to note names were not changed generally. They copied the names directly from the ship's manifest. And the place itself was named after Samuel Ellis, a Welsh immigrant who had owned the island before. It was then kind of artificially extended to create the Ellis Island Immigration Station, this federal station, which really for the first time, it was taking over from Castle Garden, which was an earlier state effort, but kind of tried to regularize immigration. But immigration was, it's almost impossible to kind of imagine today. It was, 99% passed through. If you could get there, no visas were required, and it was the engine of the city and the country's growth. I'll probably leave more of this kind of history of the city and how it came to be the linguistically diverse place it is to the book, but there are kind of, I guess the fast forward would be to 1965, when after a sort of first anti-immigration movement that culminated in 1924, the slamming shut of the door, essentially Ellis Island after that is kind of a relative ghost town, and then there are these 4 decades of relative closure. Things really, and we could really think about the parallels between 2024, 25, and 1924, many of the same factors in play. But in 1965, and we should also look at kind of what it took to reopen those doors in 1965, there is this intensification which leads to the city becoming ever more and more a kind of microcosm of the world's global linguistic diversity. Fast forward to today, half of the population of New York, this is not unique to New York, there are a number of other American cities that are like this, speak a language other than English at home, 50%. Most New Yorkers are multilingual. There are 10 different languages which actually have some kind of official city support, sort of a new kinds of legislation around language access. And those are the languages also which have over 100,000 speakers, including Yiddish, which is now growing at an amazing rate in New York with the Hasidic population, but also languages like Haitian Creole and Bengali and Russian and so on. And as I said, kind of over 750 languages, something like 40% of them from Asia. And then also these kind of structures to the linguistic diversity of the city as well. Macro communities, microcosms of the world's of regional linguistic diversity shrunk down to the size of city neighborhoods. Not sort of just enclave after enclave, but really complex patterns of mixing and language contact, multilingualism, and of course language shift. Language shift is always happening. Immigrant languages rarely surviving beyond the 3rd generation. But there are sort of differential rates of shift, and there are interesting and important efforts to arrest that and to develop languages that happen in cities like New York as well. And the whole question of what does a linguistic infrastructure look like for Babel, for this kind of city? What kinds of language access? What does this look like during a public health emergency? What does this mean during elections or making city policy? So these are some of the motivations behind our language mapping efforts, which check out, languagemap.nyc. This is from the print map that preceded it. If it seems just like a ton of text, that's by design. It's meant to kind of overwhelm you with a feeling of like, wow. But it purposely is downplaying the larger languages. We don't need to sort of see that forms of English and Spanish, as diverse as they are, just about every form of English and Spanish as well in the city. But we are sort of deliberately bringing up through mapping to significant sites. That's anything from a restaurant to a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a hometown association. These are very important, linking immigrants to their home communities. These are the sort of sites that languages here are being mapped to. And as I say, it's not just kind of random, like, oh, here's a community there. It's, of course, there are factors like housing prices and access to jobs and subway and all these things. But then there's also this kind of linguistic angle and structure to why languages are where they are, why people are settling where they're settling. So we think of, Brighton Beach, the neighborhood in South Brooklyn, as a kind of Russian zone. Certainly it is the biggest Russian-speaking area in the Western Hemisphere. And if you see a movie like Honora, for those who saw it, you'll get a sense of that world. But you should also see a movie called Brighton Fourth, a Georgian movie which was set there, which is brilliant and shows the kind of, it's mostly in Georgian, it's between Tbilisi and Brighton Beach. But it also shows this whole kind of post-Soviet world that's there. It's increasingly Central Asian, increasingly Caucasian, Siberian. The population of the Yakut speakers we've worked with in just the last few years, as people try to get away from the draft, has increased 8-fold, and now there are hundreds of speakers of Yakut, a Turkic language of Siberia, who've settled mostly in this area. That said, it's not just post-Soviet languages that are here. And also, I should say, in some ways, it's sort of recreating, you could say, in miniature, this microcosm of the Soviet Union's linguistic diversity in a way that you wouldn't necessarily actually see even in Russia or in the Soviet Union. It's in a very particular kind of mode. But then there are also speakers of a variety of Jewish languages, because it intersects with the world of the Jewish diaspora coming down Ocean Parkway. And there's also, of course, lots of speakers of Mexican Spanish and Bengali and Urdu who are also there as well. Sort of similar structures can be seen with the 100+ languages of West Africa, which are now clustered in Harlem and the Bronx. And again, as Russian can serve as a lingua franca, and that's a big part of why people are settling in a place like Brighton Beach, here, especially for the Francophone West African world, French serves as that lingua franca, Arabic to an extent for Muslim West Africans, multilingualism is the norm. And there are also sort of patterns of succession. This is also happening in kind of waves. One group moves somewhere, and then others who are proximate to it or connected with it then can settle nearby. And it's a way of getting a foothold in a new land. Likewise, the area I perhaps have worked the most, Himalayan Jackson Heights, which is really a whole world of South Asian linguistic diversity, and we had to sort of blow it up on the map, Tibetan and Nepali as lingua francas, but then a whole array of languages from across the Himalaya in this kind of vast new diaspora, 40+ languages just from sort of those parts of Himalayan Nepal. And then kind of, at least briefly, just like how does this look, how does this feel if we were walking around the city now? And again, one can do this as well in parts of San Francisco, Los Angeles. This is not just New York, but New York is a paradigm case that I know best. We're not talking about the middle of Manhattan. We're not talking about Broadway, Wall Street, Midtown. There's plenty of linguistic diversity there as well, but it's not of this residential kind. It's not. Those are not places, obviously, people can necessarily afford to live anymore. Certainly the earlier linguistic diversity of the city was in Manhattan when that was the urban core. But now it's blocks that might look like this, kind of low-slung blocks of Queens and Brooklyn, where you've got a Dominican hair salon, an Egyptian-owned cell phone store, a check cashing place with a lot of Mixteco speakers from Mexico go to, a West African hair braiding place, a Fujianese-run laundromat. A couple weeks ago, I was at the Pontic Greek kind of annual dinner celebration. This is a variety of Greek from what's now Turkey, basically, in the Black Sea area. But most everybody left after the Pontic genocide, celebrating their 60th anniversary in Astoria. It looks like the Queens Public Library actually and truly kind of offering services in these languages, or these pashkvilim from South Williamsburg, with Yiddish and Hebrew announcements and religious prohibitions that are posted around the neighborhood. It looks like Roma people in my neighborhood having sort of their own club in a defunct Polish bakery, whereas generally speaking, Roma people have felt that they need to sort of hide their identity, but here is actually a sign up saying, "Welcome, Roma people, come." It looks like this building in Jackson Heights full of these Himalayan hometown organizations, the Mustang Kitug for people who speak Loke from Mustang in Nepal, the Gyalsumdo Sewasanta representing a language with only several hundred speakers in the world from one particular valley in Nepal. A paqueteria for people from particular towns in Mexico to send packages back, not even to speak of remittances, but just sort of package, direct connections to particular towns, showing the very particular ties between certain neighborhoods in New York and certain towns in Mexico, especially in Puebla and Guerrero. Two speakers of Southern Zaza, a Kurdish language from Turkey, just hanging out in the park. A public washroom with an ad for the election in Senegal with some language in Wolof and French. A Quechua street procession. A mural in a Newari restaurant, people from Kathmandu sort of showing the connections between Kathmandu and Brooklyn. Our friend Keule Kamara, who's Kuranko from Sierra Leone, performing at a salon run by Mama Rashida from Benin. She's just out of the frame, who is sort of a Harlem legend and runs these kind of African diaspora sessions. So people are coming from particular places, speaking particular languages, and I think this is how we have to understand immigration, it's how we have to understand cities. The fact that most Mexican New Yorkers come from here, from Puebla, from Guerrero, that means that indigenous languages of Mexico are spoken at 3 times the rate in New York that they are in Mexico itself. And that might be very different for the Mexican communities in LA or San Francisco. San Francisco, I know, has a significant Yucatec Maya population. So, it's very sort of specific. Likewise with Mayan communities or Guatemalan communities, are they coming from the Western Highlands and speaking Mayan languages? Which ones? The large Garifuna community in New York especially, this is a sort of triple diaspora or quadruple diaspora situation. Enslaved people from West Africa who were brought to St. Vincent, escaped onto St. Vincent, intermarried with the local Arawakan population, now speak an Arawakan language, were then further expelled by the British to the coast of Central America, places like Belize and Honduras, from which they continue now to come, and there are many more of them now in New York than there are in places like Belize. The ongoing and ever-increasing Andean migration, especially from Ecuador, which is coming to New York and bringing every variety of Quechua, which is often sort of town by town, and then these particular sort of settlement patterns. So I don't have a lot of time, but I want to go a little bit into one example in a little more depth, which is from Nepal. This is kind of the linguistic diversity of Nepal. This is one particular place, Mustang. This is kind of a mapping onto the landscape of New York now. As I said, something like 40 plus languages of Nepal as part of this wider Himalayan diaspora. Every single language from this one valley with about 10,000 people, Mustang, is now in New York. The villages themselves are emptying out, and this is happening in many, many communities. There's even a sort of patterning of people as they move from Mustang to New York. How do they move? Well, there's actually, you see people from the sort of northern or higher altitude areas actually moving to the higher altitude areas, relatively speaking, of New York. Of course, this is 10,000 feet. This is a few hundred feet. But you can see basically, those from the southern part of the valley moving to Brooklyn, those from the northern part moving to Jackson Heights. And even those from the middle, who I've worked with the most, speaking a language called Seke, which is featured in the book, being sort of continuing to be embedded within the language group from the southern part, which is called Baragaon, usually, and living in a few kind of vertical villages in Brooklyn that I talk about. So this is the language Seke that I've been now working kind of the most closely with one of the very youngest speakers, whose name is Rasmina, who's profiled in the book. It's a language with 700 speakers total from 5 villages in this part of Nepal. And now probably more than 200 speakers have come to New York, to these vertical villages. And this is the kind of change that we're talking about. Of course, it proceeds often through intermediate steps. There are also urban populations in some of the major cities in Nepal. There's a whole kind of world of younger people especially. It's really bifurcated between sort of some older people and maybe babies staying in the village, and then everybody of working age basically being in cities. You'll go to Prospect Park on July 4th, and a significant part of the speaker population of this language is there having a picnic together. This is one of the few days that people get off. And the vertical villages are a particular kind of urban formation. These are, just sort of ordinary seeming apartment buildings where it's not 100% Seke. There are speakers of a bunch of other languages there too, but they're able to sort of recreate some of the arrangements of a village life within, at least for a time, within a New York City apartment building. Multilingualism is kind of baked in, so Seke speakers are not just kind of straightforwardly feeling pressure from English. It's the other languages of Mustang, Loke and Baragaon, that they're kind of surrounded by. It's Nepali as a national language. It's Tibetan as the kind of religious and cultural language. People are Tibetan Buddhists. And then, of course, it's also English. And so the response, to this, and working with Rasmina and other members of the communities, is you have to work between the two places. You have to have this kind of multi-sided approach where there are certain things that are better done in New York or in diaspora. There's a certain role for the diaspora urban perspective. And then, of course, the homeland, to the extent that it's accessible, which in this case at least it is to an extent, is also obviously vital for certain kinds of work in documenting the language as well. Languages like Seke don't appear on any census. I'm going to be talking tomorrow, if you haven't had enough of me, at CESTA, the Center for spatial and textual analysis, about mapping in particular, about language mapping and its particular kind of valences. Mapping languages is a challenge. It's languages move in the mouths of their speakers, they're fluid, they're changing, right? How can you sort of put a fixed point? And what do these dots mean? As I said, they're sort of significant sites, but those change, communities move. This is the digital version that I mentioned that has a lot more than just kind of images of the dots. You click on these and you have recordings that we've made, you have the stories and descriptions of different communities, and you can in various ways filter and search and see how communities are kind of related and connected to each other, and some of those patterns that I mentioned. And this kind of visibility, it's also about showing the shortcomings of the census, so that we've mapped sort of 4 to 5 times the number of languages that the census shows. Most of the languages we work on at the Endangered Language Alliance don't appear in the census at all. They're essentially invisible there, and that has all kinds of implications. So this is why the Endangered Language Alliance exists. It's an all-purpose space for anyone who cares about linguistic diversity or wants to do something about language. It's a platform. It's a place for a lot of our projects are essentially people come to us, speakers, members of different communities, and say, I want to record my grandparents. I want to do an oral history project. We want to have children's books in our language. We don't have a dictionary. How do we write our language? And then, it also stems from all the communities that we're a part of. So one of those projects is the Jewish Languages Project, which I talked about earlier in the Yiddish portion of the talk. And in many cases, the speakers can only be found in places like New York. In other cases, it's about kind of connections with the other side of the world. We're also a pretty small shoestring operation, so I don't want to give the wrong idea. I mean, we've kind of been able to struggle on for about 15 years, but we also kind of stay localized to New York because we know that a lot of what we can do is really the face-to-face, long-term relationships, trust, and it includes, the classic language documentation. If anybody has used Fieldworks, this is where you create a corpus and you analyze and transcribe and translate and so on. Recordings, and we've done that in many languages, in depth on a small number like Seke, but in some cases just one speaker who wants to record one video also, we do that too. Events that put languages on a stage where people can hear languages they've never heard before. They can hear singers, they can hear poetry, everything from sort of celebrations of International Mother Language Day that just kind of bring visibility to languages, to theatrical and musical experiments and walking tours, language walks, different kinds of collaborations. Indigenous radio, led by our friends Leobardo, a Quiche speaker from Guatemala, and Zenaida, a speaker of Mepa, also called Tlapaneco, from Guerrero in Mexico, and a Garifuna speaker who's doing karaoke and nursery rhyme stuff, and speakers of languages from Indonesia doing public events, classes, which have happened in a number of languages that don't otherwise have classes. I remember Stanford having a rule that if you had at least 3 students or something like that, you had to have the language offered. So in my time, we managed to get people together for like 3 of us and then you had to find the teacher and do all kinds of other things. But we managed to get a Uyghur class. And then through the student-initiated courses, we managed to convince this Luo guy from Kenya to teach his language. So bother Stanford to do whatever language you want to do. It's a good way to get people paid as well, if you can. Publishing and literacy. Children's books are a huge priority often, given intergenerational transmission as a focus for language activists. Most languages being oral, but then in the process of documentation, in the process of revitalization, often there's a need to write them down and to try to start publishing things and to have kind of new media and new spheres, artistic collaborations, and just to give you a sense of some of the people who are kind of making things happen. But this is from a series of photos done by the photographer Yuri Martyr, who's one of the many artists we've worked with, to, again, just like this has been shown at galleries and at the Queen's Museum, Irwin, who's featured in the book, poet, speaker, chef of Nawat, James Garifuna, Abbas, a Wahi speaker, Majda, Kabardian speaker from the Caucasus, Narayan from Nepal, speaker of Gurung, Zenaida, who I mentioned, Games as well have been created. This is a version of Loteria, the Mexican game of chance, which is kind of like bingo, but here we're sort of teaching Mixteco kids Mixteco in New York. Increasingly, language advocacy and language access, and there's been a sort of shift over the time that the Endangered Languages Alliance has been around. Now there's more and more demand for interpretation, and so we've been part of this attempt to form Indigenous Interpreter Co-op in New York, representing about a dozen different Indigenous languages of Latin America, creating PSAs. This only increased during COVID, when we kind of pivoted most of our work away from the documentation and towards public health stuff, with a few people in the Department of Health at the city level kind of helping to support it, but a range of conversations and efforts in different languages about the vaccine and about different public health matters. So an urban language organization like the ELA can sort of stand in this kind of relation to a bunch of different actors. We're independent nonprofit. I mean, we have ties to universities. I also teach at Columbia, and those are important. But we're not seeing academic institutions stepping into this work and sort of hanging up a shingle in the middle of the city, so that communities, journalists, artists, filmmakers, students, city agencies can find us. So kind of to briefly talk about where we are now and the future, I think there's, and this is where the book kind of ends, it's the question of whether this is peak linguistic diversity in cities like New York, and really cities everywhere. There's universal language shift and loss, which is happening in the homelands everywhere. So languages can't be replenished now if people are shifting in the cities. Increasingly, people are bringing, if they're coming at all now, are bringing just the national languages that they've already sort of shifted to. The whole question of what the digital realm does or doesn't offer, how many languages will ascend online, or will they mostly be invisible, and really at the sort of the bottom, if anywhere, of the digital world. There are different possible linguistic afterlives. I mean, we're thinking still, most people, about languages being kind of everyday vernaculars in all realms of life, but increasingly post-vernacular possibilities, more symbolic and performative uses of language can at least represent some form of survival, perhaps. Belatedly, we have seen the building out of some linguistic infrastructure happening with different cities. You may see little signs of it, that on the bus in San Francisco or something, you'll see some stuff in Spanish and Vietnamese, and maybe traditional characters, traditional Chinese characters. Really, and there's a sort of language industry which has emerged to kind of take advantage of some of that as well, which is complicated. There are questions about the future of cities, gentrification, the rising cost of city life. On the other hand, this means that actually endangered language communities, indigenous language communities, can be found now increasingly in suburbs, in smaller cities, in places that are much less expected, perhaps, not necessarily just or even as much New York or Los Angeles or Paris, but actually Atlanta and Tulsa and all kinds of places. And then, of course, the question of migration and the unequal mobilities, which are increasingly the case. And things have culminated just in the last couple of years in New York with the so-called migrant crisis, with the arrival of over 200,000 people, many of whom are speakers of Spanish and Russian and Haitian Creole and so on, but also creating new language communities still, or enhancing sort of and enlarging some, such as Quechua or Fulani from West Africa, and then the attempt to sort of respond to these. And maybe just fast forwarding, so we have time for a discussion and questions, to last year, the Trump campaign, a kind of new politics of language and a rhetoric around language. These are quotes from him, fulminating about languages coming into our country, not one instructor in our entire nation, which actually that's a good reason to support instruction. And then sort of some interesting, kind of weird semantic things, like truly foreign languages that nobody speaks. Well, in any case, it's good that there's an interest in linguistic diversity, but it's the wrong kind of interest. And we already now know, and we already have reason to expect all the impacts on immigration now that it's become one of the central issues of our time. It looks very much like 1924 again, but maybe in some ways worse, with mass detention, deportation, the end of TPS, the attacks on sanctuary cities, the possible creation of a new immigration system, which for the first time perhaps will prioritize English. And then recently this, which just happened on March 1st, and I think is a massive change, although maybe hard to see in the middle of all the changes that are happening right now. This is an executive order designating English as the official language of the United States. The United States has never had an official language across its nearly 250-year history, and that's by design. This has been a multilingual place fundamentally from the beginning. Approximately 300 native languages spoken north of the Rio Grande at the time of European arrival, many of which, like Lenape, have miraculously survived down to the present day, gotten all too little support, enormous pressure. We could just speak about the role of the residential schools, the sort of, which have operated, of course, in Canada and Australia and elsewhere, but in the US, where people literally were having their languages beaten out of them, the force to shift to English. On top of that, the layers of immigrant languages here. I mean, whether it's Spanish in conquered territories in the Southwest, French in Louisiana, and then also the hundreds and hundreds of languages which immigration has brought, as we see, over 750 of them to New York. All of these layers of linguistic diversity and complexity which make up this place are threatened by this. This may seem like a symbolic act in some ways, but in some ways it brings the US into line with other kind of mono-ethnic nation states. What does this mean for Hawaii? What does this mean for Puerto Rico? What does this mean for New York City, for the Bay Area? It's a lot of it sounds sort of symbolic. It's interesting to see the rhetoric of it, but then snuck in at the bottom is also the revocation of an executive order which did provide a modicum of language access at the federal level. The federal level never had anything compared to the slightly bigger modicum at the state and city levels in places like New York and California, but there was at least some requirement for agencies at the federal level to think about this. This was revoked the other day with the idea that actually maybe agencies don't have to do anything. What does that mean in terms of the US Census? As we said, the census is deeply inadequate when it comes to language. We actually got involved in the 2020 Get Out the Count efforts in New York City around the census there. The census responses depend on a number of things. Obviously, the census got very politicized with this possible citizenship question back in 2020, but also it's about what languages the census is offered in, whether people fear that the census will be used against them, and so on. The highest, the lowest rates of response to the census are in multi-ethnic immigrant neighborhoods, multilingual immigrant neighborhoods, like places like Queens. And that has all kinds of repercussions in terms of how population is understood, how funds get allocated, and so on. And that's just thinking about the Census Bureau. I mean, we can think about voting and elections. We can think about any number of things where this could have a serious impact. So although linguistic diversity is everywhere in America, and there are 70 million speakers of languages other than English at home, and at least we know in New York, 750 plus languages, clearly well over 1,000 languages spoken in the United States, more than probably have ever been spoken in any single polity. And woven deeply into the history of our country, we haven't yet built a coherent multilingual project in the way that some other countries have gone at least a little bit further. But still, I would argue that nothing is more alien to our multilingual history and our reality, not to mention our cognitive and communicative freedom, than this kind of imposition of English, and that this is a real rupture. And we'll see if there's going to be any challenge to it, legal challenge. It's not clear yet to me. I haven't seen anything. There's so much going on, obviously, and many other battles that need to be fought. But it could be that a sort of grudgingly multilingual empire that we have been is curdling into a more virulently monolingualist nation state with interesting implications in terms of language policy and language communities. So I think the importance of supporting linguistic diversity, thinking about linguistic diversity, documenting it, and of course this is not just something in America, this is something in the whole world, has never been greater. I think we need to look to our cities and the multilingualism that's in them. And yeah, thank you for listening.